It all started during my first semester at college. I was drowning in my chemistry class, barely scraping by, when I met Zach. He sat a few rows behind me, his thick glasses and messy hair making him stand out. He wasn't someone I would have approached on my own, but after one particularly brutal test, he approached me, offering to help. He was socially awkward, his words tumbling over each other, but he seemed harmless. More importantly, he was good at chemistry, and I needed the help. At first, Zach was a lifesaver. He explained concepts I couldn't wrap my head around and even helped me study for the next test. We'd meet in the library, where he'd scribble notes and diagrams for hours. I was grateful, but kept our relationship strictly academic. He'd sometimes ask personal questions, what my favorite movies were, what music I liked, but I brushed them off, steering the conversation back to chemistry. The semester flew by, and soon it was the last day of class. After our final exam, Zach caught up with me in the hallway. He was unusually nervous, his face flushed. That's when he asked me out. I was taken aback. I hadn't seen him in that way, and I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I lied. I told him I was leaving for Miami that weekend to visit family. He nodded, his smile faltering, and I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The texts started the very next day. At first, they were innocent. "How's Miami?" Or, "Did you get there safely?" I replied a few times, keeping it vague, but his messages grew more frequent, more invasive. "Who are you with?" "What's the weather like?" "Send me a picture." I stopped responding, hoping he'd lose interest. One evening, I went out with friends to unwind. We were sitting at a diner, laughing and sharing fries, when my phone buzzed. It was Zach. The message made my stomach drop. "You're not in Miami." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. How did he know? I hadn't posted anything online. My friends noticed my sudden silence and asked if I was okay. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was a lucky guess. But deep down, I felt the edges of fear creeping in. Later that night, as I was settling into bed, my phone buzzed again. It was Zach, and this time, he was outside my apartment. He sent a picture of my front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I lived alone, and it was late. My hands shook as I dialed my mom, but she didn't pick up. Desperate, I texted back, "Leave now. My brother is home, and he's calling the police." For a long, agonizing minute, there was no response. Then, I heard footsteps retreating. I peeked through the peephole and saw Zach walking away, his shoulders hunched. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The next day, he sent me a wall of text. The message was unhinged, accusing me of leading him on, of using him. He wrote that I owed him a chance, that he'd helped me when no one else did. The entitlement in his words terrified me. I showed the messages to campus security and the local police. They took it seriously and contacted him, warning him to stay away from me. After that, Zach disappeared. He didn't show up to class, didn't send another message. It was like he'd vanished. But the damage was done. I couldn't sleep for weeks, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I walked home, I imagined him lurking in the shadows. Months later, I found out he had dropped out of school. No one seemed to know where he went, and I didn't want to ask. The fear stayed with me, though. I'd replay the events over and over in my mind, wondering if I could have handled things differently. But the truth was, Zach's obsession wasn't my fault. I didn't owe him anything. Looking back, I'm grateful I reported him. If I hadn't, who knows what could have happened? It's a chilling reminder that we can never truly know what's going on in someone's mind, and that we should always trust our instincts when something feels wrong. Even now, I sometimes wake up at night, imagining a knock at the door, wondering if Zach ever really let go. It was the last day of 4th grade, the kind of day that felt like it would stretch on forever, with the promise of summer vacation hanging in the air. I was sitting on the edge of my desk, swinging my feet, waiting for the final bell. My best friend, Dennis, sat a few rows over, doodling on the corner of his notebook. We had big plans for the summer: bike rides, sleepovers, and hours of video games. But little did I know, this day would turn into something I'd never forget, no matter how hard I tried. The bell rang, and kids spilled into the hallways like water from a burst dam, laughing and shouting. I was about to head to the front of the school to wait for my mom when a man appeared in the doorway of our classroom. He looked rushed, his eyes darting around as if he didn't want to be there. He wore a crumpled shirt and jeans, and he smiled a little too wide when he saw me. "You're Dennis's friend, right?" he asked, looking directly at me. "I'm his uncle. Dennis's mom had an emergency and sent me to pick him up. I need you to let your teacher know so I can get him quickly." It sounded reasonable enough at first. Adults had emergencies all the time, and sometimes they sent other family members to pick kids up. But something about the way he spoke, the hurried tone, the way his hands fidgeted, made my stomach churn. Still, I nodded and went to find our teacher. Miss Clark frowned when I told her, but she walked over to talk to the man. He flashed a friendly smile and said something about being in a rush. Dennis's mom wasn't the type to be late or disorganized, so Miss Clark hesitated, but eventually she nodded and called Dennis over. But Dennis didn't show up. "Oh, right, he must have gone to the bathroom," the man said quickly. "No worries, I'll get him, come on." I froze for a moment, confused. Why was he asking me to go with him? But he didn't wait for me to answer. He placed a hand on my shoulder, lightly, but firm enough to nudge me toward the door. I glanced back at Miss Clark, who was already busy with another student. I wanted to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. He steered me out of the classroom, and before I knew it, we were heading toward the parking lot. "Where's Dennis?" I asked as we walked. "He's already in the car," the man replied, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "We'll pick him up on the way out." The parking lot felt endless, the rows of cars blurring together. When we reached his vehicle, a beat-up blue sedan, there was no sign of Dennis. My chest tightened. The man unlocked the car and opened the door, motioning for me to get in. My feet refused to move. "Come on, we don't have all day," he snapped, his tone suddenly sharp. That's when I knew. Something was wrong. Very wrong. But before I could react, he grabbed my arm and shoved me into the car, slamming the door shut. The locks clicked, sealing me inside. I banged on the windows and screamed, but the parking lot was nearly empty, and no one seemed to hear me. The man drove fast, muttering to himself as he glanced at me in the rearview mirror. My heart pounded so loud I could barely think. After what felt like an eternity, he pulled up to a small, run-down house surrounded by trees. He dragged me inside, locking the door behind him. "Where's Dennis?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Downstairs," he said, pointing to a door at the end of the hallway. "Go on." The hairs on my neck stood up. "I don't want to go down there." His face darkened. "You don't have a choice." He shoved me toward the door and forced me down the creaky wooden stairs, locking the door behind me. The basement was cold and damp, the faint smell of mildew in the air. I pressed my back against the wall, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of Dennis. But it was empty. Completely empty. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I remembered the kitchen upstairs and how I'd seen a phone on the counter when we walked in. The 911 lessons from school flashed in my mind. Quietly, I climbed the stairs and jiggled the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on the door, my voice hoarse from yelling. Then I had an idea. Using a rusty old pipe from the basement, I jammed it under the door as leverage. It didn't break the lock, but it made enough noise that the man came rushing back to check. The moment he opened the door, I bolted past him, snatching the phone from the kitchen counter. I dialed 911 as he lunged toward me. "Help!" I screamed into the receiver. "He's trying to—" The operator's calm voice guided me as I ran into a pantry to hide. The man's footsteps thundered through the house, and I held my breath, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. Within minutes, red and blue lights lit up the windows. The man cursed and tried to flee, but the police broke down the door and tackled him before he could escape. It turned out he wasn't Dennis's uncle at all. He was a co-worker of Dennis's dad, someone who had been fired and held a grudge. He thought kidnapping Dennis would send a message, but he'd grabbed the wrong kid. Even now, years later, I can't shake the fear I felt that day. I still double-check locks and second-guess strangers. It's something I'll carry with me forever. A lesson about trust, caution, and the strange, unpredictable ways people can show their worst selves. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, the end of another school year and the beginning of summer. The plan had been simple. Hit the beach, light a bonfire, and let the night carry their laughter into the sky. But the storm had other ideas. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder growled in the distance, and lightning flashed across the gloomy horizon. Stuck in a small town with nothing else to do, the group, Cassie, Eddie, Briar, and Owen, found themselves restless, itching for adventure. "Let's go to the old elementary school," Eddie suggested, his grin daring and full of mischief. Briar shook her head. "That place is boarded up for a reason. People say it's haunted." "People say a lot of things," Eddie shot back, already pulling on his jacket. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen?" It was Owen who finally convinced them, his steady voice reminding them they'd regret spending their last night together doing nothing. By the time they reached the school, the storm had intensified, but the thrill of the unknown overpowered their hesitation. Eddie shattered a window with a rock, and the sound of glass breaking seemed louder than the thunder. One by one, they climbed in, their flashlights slicing through the thick, suffocating darkness. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Desks sat in perfect rows, their surfaces coated with dust, and faded posters hung limply on the walls. It was as if time had stopped the day the building was abandoned. Lightning illuminated the room briefly, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. "Creepy as hell," Cassie whispered, clutching Briar's arm. They ventured deeper, stepping cautiously through the labyrinth of hallways. The storm's howl outside was muffled, replaced by the unnerving silence of the school. Their flashlights revealed old drawings pinned to bulletin boards, some faded to the point of illegibility. A solitary teddy bear lay forgotten in the corner of one classroom, its button eye dangling by a thread. Eddie laughed nervously. "See, just an old building, nothing to be scared of." As if in response, a faint scraping sound echoed down the hall. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. "Probably just the wind," Owen said, though his voice betrayed his unease. But then they saw it. Movement in the shadows. A fleeting figure in the doorway of a classroom ahead. The light from their flashlights couldn't reach far enough to see details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a person, or something resembling one. "Who's there?" Eddie called, his voice breaking slightly. No answer. They huddled together, their fear growing with each passing second. The figure disappeared into the room, and a low creak of a door shutting sent shivers down their spines. "We should leave," Briar whispered, her eyes wide with terror. But Eddie, ever the instigator, shook his head. "Number. We need to see who it is. What if it's just some kid messing around like us?" Reluctantly, they followed him. The classroom door was ajar, and Eddie nudged it open with his foot. The room was empty. Desks and chairs were overturned as if there had been a struggle, but there was no sign of the figure. "That's it, I'm out," Cassie said, backing away. But before they could retreat, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Slow, deliberate, growing louder. They bolted into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut. Hearts pounding, they crouched beneath the teacher's desk. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The room fell deathly silent except for the sound of their own shallow breathing. Then the door creaked open. The figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by a flash of lightning, its head tilted slightly as if studying them. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. Cassie's tears streamed silently down her face. Briar clutched her arm so tightly it hurt. Eddie, for once, looked terrified. Owen's hand trembled as he held the flashlight, but he didn't dare shine it directly at the figure. Then the lights flickered, just for a second. But in that brief moment, the figure was gone. "Go!" Owen whispered urgently. They didn't hesitate. Clambering out through the window they'd entered, they ran through the rain, their soaked shoes slapping against the pavement as they made their way back to the car. Nobody spoke, their breaths labored, their hearts racing. They didn't stop until they were miles away, parked under the fluorescent glow of a gas station. Silence hung heavy in the air as they sat in the car, trying to process what had happened. "What was it?" Briar finally asked, her voice barely audible. No one had an answer, and none of them ever returned to the school to find out. Years later, when the storm rolled in and thunder echoed in the distance, each of them would remember that night. They would remember the figure in the doorway, its shadow etched into their minds, and the feeling of being watched long after they thought they were safe. And though they never spoke of it again, the memory lingered, a silent, haunting reminder of what they'd seen but could never explain.